Right, I'd like to advise that the following staff are in attendance, either in the council chamber or remotely. We have the Head of Planning Services, James Freeman, the Planning Policy Manager, Jill Peat, the Conservation and Design Manager, Simon Agar, the Senior Planner, Natalie Earle, and from Democratic Services, we have Joe Millard and Billy Attaway. We also have Ben Meekings, our traffic consultant. Are there any other officers in attendance that have not been named? Okay. Let's say that Councillor Valentine is attending remotely. He is a member of this panel, will be able to join in any discussions, but he can't vote. The emergency evacuation procedure, I trust we're all familiar with that. Does anybody want me to read it out? Thank you. Can I ask if there are any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies have been received from Councillors Bonney, Gould, Jackson and Jays, and the substitutes this evening are Councillors Knights, Valentine, Rolls and Woodford. Thank you.
Are there any declarations of interest? There are no hands. Okay, I'd like to advise that items on the agenda are Part A reports. And I'd just like to say there has been some meetings recently have got a little out of hand, so I'm going to be very strict about going through the chair. If people can indicate they want to speak, wait until they're called in and go through the chair. That way we can have a nice, smooth running meeting. It's easier for officers to minute and everybody knows what they're voting on, should we be voting on anything, which we will be. So there's no declarations of interest. So I'd like to go into part 4, which is the Swale Borough Local Plan Review, Strategic Transport Modelling Evidence. And I'd like to hand over to Natalie Earle, who will introduce this item. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everyone. So this report sets out the results of the latest stage of the strategic transport modelling work, which has been undertaken as part of the local plan review. This is a technical piece of evidence base, which at this stage is highway focused and intended to give a broad overview of how the network will perform. The location of the allocations included in the modelling work are those broadly set out in the preferred option, as was appropriate for this stage in the local plan process. The modelling work shows that there are challenges for the local plan review to work through, including several hotspots of congestion across Swale on both the strategic and the local networks. Further analysis of the problem junctions has started with KCC Highways and National Highways, who are what is now the old Highways England are called. And this will continue. So this is to consider whether there are any mitigations that could be undertaken to overcome the congestion issues arising, or whether there are junctions where there is limited or no capacity for improvements. These mitigations would relate to both increasing the capacity of junctions and or whether higher modal shifts could be achieved with either improvements to public transport and or putting more active travel measures in place. So following this assessment of the hotspots, there would then need to be a view taken as to whether the level of development proposed through the local plan review cannot be mitigated against and therefore cannot be accommodated, or whether there is an alternative, more feasible distribution of sites, which would result in fewer congestion hotspots across the highway network, which can't be mitigated. So a further transport modelling run will probably be required to either inform and or test the establishment of an agreed development strategy and the development sites to be included. That run may include testing options to demonstrate whether any particular sites are feasible from a transport perspective, or whether a level of development being proposed is not sustainable within the highway network within the local plan review period. A local plan inspector will normally accept a certain level of increase in congestion as a result of local plan allocations at the examination in public when we get there, but they will need to see initiatives from both the council and the promoters of allocations on how this will be minimised and mitigated, especially through modal shift. However, neither they nor National Highways or KCC Highways will accept any negative impacts on safety. So this, along with the results coming out of the model, illustrate the need for Swale to take ambitious steps towards greater modal shift and promote and implement more sustainable and active travel initiatives across Swale. This work is already beginning, as can be seen with Faversham Town Council's work on their exemplary LC WIP, which is a walking and cycling infrastructure plan, and is being taken to the Joint Transport Board on the 28th of February. And Swale Council has just appointed a new active travel officer who will be working closely with on the local plan going forward. As the chair said earlier, I have my colleague Ben, who is an associate director from the project centre here tonight, who will be able to answer any technical questions on the report. His paper is at Appendix 3 and explains the modelling report in a slightly simplified way, because unfortunately transport planning is a dark art and is very complex. But just to note, he didn't actually undertake the modelling himself. So the recommendations for tonight are for you to 1, note the strategic transport modelling results at Appendix 1, 2, recommend to Cabinet that this work be part of the evidence base used to inform the preferred option stage, Regulation 19 of the local plan review, and 3, to undertake further focused analysis on what the optimum development strategy would look like in terms of minimising the impacts on the transport system. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Natalie. So the recommendations are on page 5 of the report. Does anybody have any questions? Right, there are no hands, so I'll move the recommendations. Can I have a seconder? That's seconded by Richard Palmer. Those in favour? Okay, thank you. That's carried unanimously. Can we go to agenda item 5, which is the proposed new conservation area at Rodmersham Parish Council? Can I ask Simon Algar to introduce this item, please?
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, members. Sharon, I'd like to share my screen if that's okay with everyone. Spare me a second.
Does that work? Can people see that? Yeah, okay.
Don't know if you can see my screen.
We can't. You send it to me.
Just spare me a second. Try again. Oh, here we go. Sorry, it's just having some technical problems. Hopefully this will work. Right.
That's it. Yeah, well done.
Okay. Right. Okay. So this report is essentially relating to the proposed designation of a new conservation area centred around Rodmersham Parish Church, and this follows on from the recent review work we've done in relation to Rodmersham Green and Tunstall. As part of the Rodmersham Green review work, we looked at the area around Rodmersham Green Conservation Area and its setting, and noted that there was a distinctive cluster of buildings and spaces a little bit further out that seemed to us to be quite significant heritage terms, but were too far away from Rodmersham Green Conservation Area itself to be considered as a possible extension. So we felt it was appropriate to investigate the area further and carry out an assessment. The conclusion reached was that the area does possess the right qualities to be considered as a conservation area. So we've been out to public consultation on the assessment document just before Christmas and into the new year, and we've had some feedback from local residents, amongst others, most of which has been very positive. and the recommendation is to take forward the designation of a new conservation area. The recommendation as set out in the report is for members of the local plan panel to note the public consultation draft and the representations made on this by the interested parties. Secondly, to support the changes that have been made in response to the assessment document following that consultation. I'll just briefly run you through the changes that have been proposed. Firstly, it's probably helpful if I just quickly run you through the conclusions that we came to in deciding that the area was appropriate for conservation area designation. I don't know if you can see my screen clearly. I'll perhaps blow this up for you a little bit. These are the summary key characteristics. Summary of significance for the proposed area. It's a small settlement which originated as a farming community from the medieval period. It contains the ancient parish church and graveyards, which provide the visual focus to the village, or should we say hamlet, and this contrasts vividly with the domestic buildings around it. There's an architectural contribution made by several listed buildings, as well as some noteworthy non-designated buildings. There's a strong sense of visual identity provided by the parish church and by Church Street, and there's an interesting mix of building styles from several different periods. There's also the use of vernacular building materials, in particular timber framing, flintwork, brickwork and Kent peg tiles. There's a strong rural character with green verges and changing vistas, and also a good contribution made by mature trees and hedgerows. There's a strong relationship between the village and its surrounding landscape, which can be experienced through a number of views. You'll note that there's a public right-of-way which runs straight into the conservation area from the west side. And despite its close proximity to Sittingbourne, it retained a strong independent sense of identity and place. Just going back to the document itself, sorry, the report itself, the main feedback that we had was that there was strong support for the conservation area designation, but there were some suggestions for change, most notably to include Ashgore's house, which is a slightly isolated property to the north of the conservation area. If I just take you to the maps.
Could you give us page references?
Sorry, yeah, this is, let me just take you to the report itself.
Page 185.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so if I just load this up a little bit, those who can't find the page quickly, the original proposal for the conservation area is essentially this area here, more or less. Suggestion was to include this property here called Ashgore's house, which is slightly isolated but still not too far away from the cluster of buildings. Having sort of given that further consideration, we felt that was quite appropriate. So we've rearranged the boundary line to include it. It's a slightly awkward arrangement in that you've got a slightly long strip here with no obvious kind of field boundary to align it with, so we've just kind of aligned it with the edge of the road more or less, to allow for inclusion of the hedgerows and planting along there. There was also a proposal, it's probably best if I show you on our GIS, spare me a second. There was a suggestion from a number of parties to also include a cluster of development here further to the southwest of the proposed conservation area. We've got an existing listed building here, Rodmersham House, which is the manor house for the area, and some related farm buildings. We did give consideration to including this as part of the conservation area, but we felt it was too far distant from the proposed conservation area boundary, and the existing listed building itself gives a fair degree of protection to the cluster. You've also got another separate listed barn here. We felt the sort of, in planning terms, any sort of potential development taking place near Rodmersham House would need to give strong consideration to the setting of that listed building. So we felt this area was already quite well protected, and hence we felt it wasn't appropriate to extend the boundary that far south, particularly given that the intervening space isn't significant in its own right. One of the reasons for bringing the review forward, as members will be aware, is the current applications we have for Highstead Park. If I just show you where the scheme for the area is in relation to the Highstead Park, this is the landscape framework plan for the Highstead Park scheme. This is effectively the conservation area is more or less outlined here in red, and then you've got Rodmersham Green down here. I don't know if you can see my cursor wiggling around. That was one of the reasons for bringing forward this work, obviously to help inform the development management process around the Highstead Park scheme. Just as a mini update, really, we received this photograph from one of the local residents following the consultation, which gives you an idea of the setting, how much the setting of the area has changed. This building here is Church Farmhouse, just off the main street. This is a Grade 2 listed building, and this is the barn that's referenced in the document with graffiti from the soldiers that stayed there during the Second World War. These buildings still exist. This Oast House has been lost, and this barn along the road frontage has also been lost, but obviously there's still a strong agricultural character to the area. Unfortunately, a lot of the orchard trees have now been lost that you can see in this photograph, but they've been replaced by arable fields. I hope that's useful by way of an update, and I'm happy to answer any questions members may have. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, I think this is an excellent piece of work. I think the decision to include Ashgall's house is a wise one. Is there any of the glebe land that should perhaps have been considered to be incorporated? Simon?
Not that I'm aware of, Chairman. There wasn't. I haven't noticed any in visiting the site, and none's been drawn to my attention.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I just pick up this very far north bit, or Ashgall House, or whatever it's called? What is either side of the road between there and the beginning of the main conservation area? Are those just open fields or buildings or trees or what?
There's no buildings, but I think they're just fields. Simon, can you be more specific?
Yep, I can confirm it's just open fields, and we've basically set the conservation area boundary there, sort of 2 meters from either side of the road, just to pick up. There are some elements of hedgerows and some trees, but it's largely open. So the conservation area designation would give some protection to the hedgerow and trees along the road frontage, but there's no development per se. It's just open sort of arable fields.
I ask therefore, in that connection, is there any danger by extending the conservation area to include that northern house that we make any, should we call it, freeing up of the area between there and the main conservation area, where people may say, well, if that extends the conservation area, does it in reality extend the built-up village envelope and actually encourage development along both sides, either on one side or the other?
That is what had occurred to me. So, Simon?
I mean, the area of land in question is open countryside. It's a long way outside the nearest settlement boundary. In fact, there is no settlement boundary at all for Rodmersham hamlet per se, because it's such a small cluster of buildings. So there'd be very strong presumption against any development taking place at that location, and the designation of a conservation area would strengthen the existing controls and make any sort of possible development between Ashcores and the main cluster of buildings extremely unlikely.
I'm satisfied.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? No. Okay, I mean, the view is quite clear when you're in Rodmersham. You can see between those two bits, you know, Ashcore House and the main body of the hamlet, and I think the view would be something that would be protected by the conservation area designation. Simon?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I mean, there's some. I mean, it's Ashcore's house is effectively, as I think the parish council pointed out, the sort of it's almost the gateway to the little cluster of buildings around the church. So it seems quite appropriate to include it, and because it's at a slightly higher level than the other buildings around the church, it provides some long distance views, which are quite significant, and it helps to sort of see the conservation area in a wider context. So yeah, I think it's wholly appropriate to include Ashcores, following that feedback we've had.
Okay, thank you. So the recommendations are on page 155. First recommendation is to note the content of a public consultation draft of a character appraisal or management strategy document produced for the assessment relating to the proposed new conservation area, and the representations made on this by interested parties, details of which are set out in the report appendices. Are we happy to note that? Agreed. Right, I can now have a proposal and a seconder. That's proposed by Councillor Henderson, seconded by Councillor Palmer. Those in favour, please indicate. That's unanimous. Second recommendation, to support the changes to the assessment document proposed by officers in response to the representations received during the course of a public consultation. And I would like to thank everybody who took part in that consultation. So can I have the proposed by Councillor Henderson, seconded by Councillor Knight. Those in favour? That's carried unanimously. I think that's the end of the meeting, isn't it? Thank you all for coming tonight. We'll be meeting again next month, I hope. Good night.